A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are watching us from. I'm Amrita Srirangam, and on behalf of the Water Policy Center, COVID-19 Dialogue, Sectoral Impacts, Global Responses, and Enhancing Resilience to Future Pandemics, it gives me great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, chair, and participants who have joined the session. To chair this session, we have Dr. Liaquat A. Khan with us today. It is my privilege to introduce the chair. Dr. Liaquat A. Khan is an associate professor in Department of Civics and Politics, University of Mumbai. He is also the coordinator for postgraduate diploma in International Studies program at the university. Specialized in defense and strategic studies and Eurasian studies, he has published numerous articles and research papers in national and international journals. Besides, he has coordinated many national and international seminars and conferences. He also visited United States in 2009-10 to attend International Visitor and Leadership Program. Without extending further, I request Dr. Liaquat A. Khan to take charge of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrita, for spending some time onto my small biodata, which I had to give at a last moment. Like, I'm really thankful for the Water Policy Center, Mr. Rausa Bauskar and his team, that they have arranged this particular wonderful webinar in bringing in a lot of people from so many diverse areas and diverse fields. And because in this pandemic, views are very important. Unless until you have a view, how can you go ahead? Unless until you think of having having an objective, how can you move forward? And that's the reason why I really thank him that he has brought in a lot of new dimensions to, and he has made everybody to think onto what Water Policy Center means, and thereby we have till 2 o'clock we have been given the time to kindly adhere to the rules, and the Chatham House rules also follows that whoever would like to quote would first have to ask for the speaker's permission or the author's permission, so that it becomes easy for the authors to give you the right view, and also further explain his ideas, because in a very short time right now each panelist has to give his ideas or views within a very short time. So he will also have a crunch of what he's speaking. So with this idea, I thought of first calling upon Pulufela Nestuera, Professor and Executive Dean, Durban University of Technology, South Africa, and he will be speaking on how COVID-19 and future pandemics will geo-economic, social, and political relations worldwide. So with this small note, I would request Fulu Netsuera to kindly begin his views, and he will be speaking for around 7 to 10 minutes. And if the organizers extend, we can extend the discussion. But right now the organizers have given us a very strict time, so we have to abide by the time. It's not my time. Since we are in a pandemic world, the time is very important, and we are here to hear from South Africa, a friend from South Africa speaking on the various issues of pandemics. Yeah, over to Professor Fulu. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Khan. I hope everybody can hear me. Greetings from South Africa, from the city of Durban. I want to thank the Water Policy Center for putting together this important conference. I want to thank specifically Professor Bawaska for inviting me to speak. We continue to collaborate and to talk to each other. And greetings to everybody in India and all over the world. I hope I can just share a few slides of mine. And I hope that you can see it now. Can you see it now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can see. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I'm going to try my level best to talk speedily through this because we don't have enough time. Now, what I've decided to do is look at not only COVID-19, but all other pandemics that have happened before and the effect that they've had on international relations, on the economy, and so on and so forth, so that we get an idea of where we're going in as far as various pandemics are concerned, and whether or not humanity is learning anything and acclimatizing to the impact that pandemics have upon humanity. Now, I categorize pandemics in generally two main groups. There are those that are natural pandemics, such as climate change, the hurricanes, and so on and so forth. Then there are and diseases such as this one. Some of them, of course, are alleged to be engineered by humans. And of course, we have got man-made pandemics, such as wars, huge catastrophes, such as population explosion and the consequence and the effect that it has on humanity and its sustainability. Now, what I did was I went back to history to look at major global pandemics that have happened over time. And you will see that we've got many of those. The medical ones that have happened since time immemorial, starting with the plague of Athens that consumed 100,000 lives, to the Roman Empire, what they called the Antonine Plague in AD 165 that took 5 million people, to today with COVID-19. You will see that by comparison, COVID-19 in terms of human lives cannot be comparable with some of the major pandemics that have hit humanity. There are many that have been much more devastating than COVID-19. However, because we are here at a juncture where technology and social media play a different role and connect us as a globe much more than before. Therefore, the emphasis on the impact of this pandemic and all other future pandemics are going to be much more emphasized than the real effect that they have on humanity. So we will hear a lot of screaming and shouting and jostling over the consequence, the genesis, the origin, the impact than we will ever have had before, because we have got the abilities and the technologies to share the information. Now, there are those man-made epidemics, not epidemics, rather catastrophes such as wars. And you will see that by comparison, most of the wars that we have put together or generated over centuries have consumed much more lives than, and devastated us also economically, than majority of health pandemics that have met humanity. If you go to World War II, for argument's sake, it is estimated that nearly 118 million people were lost worldwide. If you go for argument's sake to World War I, it is estimated that 40 million lives were lost to humanity. That is not comparable to any other global pandemic, health pandemic. Now, what does the World Health Organization say about all of these pandemics? There are some differences between pandemics, the health of the nations, as well as diseases. And those are some of the definitions that the World Health Organization has given. I just won't have enough time to run through that because you have given me very little time. Now I'm going to move on. Now, if you look at this particular slide, here I talk about the biggest killer diseases in history. And these are not pandemics per se, because the definition of a pandemic is different to that of a disease. Now you will see that diseases cumulatively over time have killed many people. Malaria, for argument's sake, is estimated to have killed 50 billion people since it emerged, or since humanity met with this disease. Smallpox has killed over 500 million people, even though we say it is extinct now. Now, there are many other important causes of death, and by rank you will see that respiratory diseases are some of the major contributors to death globally. And those are the figures that we have for the various years. But even if you look at those various diseases, you will see that the effect that they have on low-income countries vis-a-vis high-income countries is also different. So what kills us in the middle-income countries versus in the low-income countries is also different. Here I talk specifically about COVID-19. You will see that COVID-19 in totality has killed nearly 1 million people. It is far less comparable to other pandemics that have come before it. And besides that, I think what we have managed to do when you look at all other pandemics is you will see that they occur for a period of between 2 and 3 years, majority of them. So a pandemic doesn't last for more than 4 or 5 years. Usually a cure is going to be found in the foreseeable future. And I believe that a cure will be found now in the coming few days in as far as COVID-19 is concerned. Now, what is also interesting here is that even though we have always perceived the United States to have suffered much more greatly than all other nations, it is because of popular media and because of television generally. The United States per capita has not suffered as much as Peru, nor has it suffered as much as Spain in terms of losing lives. So these figures do make it much more clear to us. Now, I'm going to run fast. I see that you are showing me that time might be running up. Now, the top 5 global concerns that we have today, and this has been measured through various census, various surveys in the world. Currently, the major concern is coronavirus. But remember that people are dying much more of malaria today, even of AIDS today, than they are dying of COVID-19. Why is it that people are much more concerned about coronavirus vis-a-vis unemployment, when the effects of unemployment and poverty and destitution is much more pronounced than COVID-19? It is because of the way in which media, popular media in particular, is able to share, but also because of the scare, how we share scary news, and the probability that all of humanity will be subjected to this pandemic and might be affected or even die. Now, if you were to look at the economic factors, you will see that COVID-19, specifically at the time where it started, this is around February, March, April there, when it was devastating Spain and Italy in particular. At this particular time, there was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of panic, but you can see now that things are starting to stabilize. And at that particular time, people started disinvesting, they started taking their money away from various stocks. Hence, big corporates, some corporates had crumbled, many closed down, including small businesses. But because a lot of countries also went through lockdowns, a lot of small organizations, SMEs in particular, had to close down. Now, the projection in terms of global economic growth for this year, as you can see, is going to be very dismal. With the exception of China, all other countries are going to perform way dismally. And I suppose that there are a lot of reasons why China continue to perform better than everybody else, and we can argue why. Some of those reasons include that China is able to contain information spread from within China. So we don't even know how the virus is spreading within China and the devastation that it has within the country. So it continues to operate as if things are a bit normal compared to other countries. Now, let's look at the effects that coronavirus has had on various industries. You will see that it devastated different industries differently. And this is just but an example of how coronavirus has devastated specifically the tech industry. One would have assumed that the tech industry would have benefited greatly out of coronavirus, because everybody now cannot meet physically. We all need laptops, we all need iPads, and we all need phones so that we can communicate better. But that has not necessarily happened. I would assume that the manufacturing of all of those gadgets has gone down drastically because of the lockdown, but it will pick up once more. And what we have also realized in South Africa is that notebooks, for argument's sake, and computers generally, those are a scarce resource at the moment. And it becomes very difficult for one to find a laptop today. Now, as far as unemployment is concerned, you will see that unemployment has risen. In some countries, double, triple. You can see the effect it has had on the United States, for argument's sake. In other countries, not so much. If you look at Japan, for instance, it has had minimal effect. If you look at Italy, the effect is also a little bit pronounced than it is in the United States of America. Now, I'm just going to skip all of these. Now, what we have learned about major catastrophes and pandemics over time is that nations have been able to come together and say, let us put our heads together, let us find ways of containing and managing these pandemics that devastate us internationally. And what they did, in particular in relation to World War I, was to put together the League of Nations in 1920, and out of World War II, they put together the United Nations, and they also, then the Bretton Woods Institutes were put together to help those nations that would suffer greatly from wars and other catastrophes such as diseases. So the IMF, the World Bank, all of those institutions have been put together, and there is a lot of politicking around that. As you will see that the veto in the United Nations Security Council also speaks greatly to how each of the 5 veto nations have tried to use their power to block important resolutions, specifically pertaining, if you look at these resolutions, you will see they pertain to colonialism, they pertain to wars, they pertain to areas where each of these five have got big interests. Such as colonialism, you will see that the United Kingdom, for argument's sake, had vetoed a lot of resolutions pertaining to undoing of colonialism. Now, the pandemic, this one, COVID-19, this is how I've classified and categorized the various sectors and the effect that it has had. If you were to look at the global economy, dismally, we are going to perform badly, but of course, the economy is going to be resuscitated. If you were to look at education, you will see that it is a mixed bag. In some countries, they've performed better. In other countries, they've caught up technologically, and online learning has boomed, for argument's sake. Those companies that are invested in online learning and those billionaires that own those companies, you will see that they've doubled, tripled their billions overnight. Global tourism has been impacted very negatively. Global political relations, you will see what is going on now with China and America, the USA, very bad. But that is out of the scope of the pandemic per se. There are other economic interests, of course, that influences those particular relationships. Global pollution, we have had great gains in as far as that is concerned. Global health, we have performed very dismally. Colleagues, I'm just going to leave it here because I know that I've already eaten more than 10 minutes that you had allocated to me. Professor Khan, back to you. Thank you so much. Professor Khan, you are still muted, yeah.
Yeah. Professor Fulu, it was wonderful hearing you on the issues of different aspects of pandemic deaths and pandemic, how people were faring with the pandemic, and how they are right now. One thing is very much important that we have to understand that this pandemic has brought us to understand that health is more important. Your staying home, staying safe is more important rather than running the economic the economic machine. And thereby you see that the states are now trying to get hold on its own population and to bring in a lot of. In India, we now are talking of Atmanirbhar Bharat. Atmanirbhar is self-sufficient, self-reliant country, and that's a reason that it's a need of the hour, which has to be seen. And like in India also, there are very bad situations that we had after the lockdown. Like to name some one or two odd problems that we see during pandemics. Immediately after the pandemic, there are migrant population which went from Mumbai to different part of the country, and there was a huge, like it was one of the biggest migrant population which went. Like this was more than the partition of India also, and that's why, and that has affected not only Mumbai but also many parts of the country, because we never had thought of that this major population will have to leave the city, and after the lockdown is being removed, we now are in a situation where we don't have people to work. There are now labor population which is there to help the cities, which earlier was more dependent onto the labor population, and this labor population has moved out, and now we have this economic engine has actually stopped. And how to go about without the support of the state? And the state has to really come out on its own, not only look towards the state but also look towards the people, and thereby bring in a lot of it has also to switch from the earlier economy to a new economy. Now the earlier economy was more connected to the world. Now we have disconnected to the economics, and thereby you still have to sustain the world. So with this small note, I really thank you and you have actually provoked so many questions to come in. Lot of questions. I am expecting a lot of questions to be drawn in with your presentation. Now we have another presenter, Professor Neeraj. Is Professor Hatega there? Professor Neeraj Hatega. Professor Neeraj Hatega, is it there?
No, sir. Neeraj sir has not joined the meeting.
Achha, so if he has not joined, then we'll take the next.
Yeah, he has not joined yet. He has not joined yet, so we can.
So what we'll do is I could see Dr. Subodh Subodh there.
Yes.
Professor Subodh is the professor and director to Center for Healthcare Management, Academic Staff College of India, Hyderabad. And we have a lot of new insights which are coming from Hyderabad. And Hyderabad is again one of the city which was very largely affected with the migrant population. And it again, not only migrant population, but the city also was affected by the economic engine, which like Mumbai, Hyderabad is also suffering from the same economic engine that we are suffering. And apart from this, we also would like to say that there is a health engine which has to be looked after, and thereby the state is really in a situation where now it has to take health sector as a very primary core sector, which has to be reflected into all the policy network of the state. So I request Professor Subodh to kindly take on this particular panel and kindly make your presentation within 10 minutes. Like we don't have much other time. Whatever you can flag on your issues, and we will be happy that you will be able to provoke many questions onto this particular presentation. Over to Professor Subodh.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Liaquat, and I would like to thank the Water Policy Center, Mr. Rao Sahib and Dr. Saraswati for giving me this opportunity. I will do a quick screen share. If you can see this, all of you, I hope you can see this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the COVID in the health sector from a policy perspective. I just want to start with a major question, which, as an economist, we keep arguing that COVID pandemic has started right now. But when you look at historically in India, we are actually performed very bad in our health sector. So we have a ranking in health sector by Lancet is only 145, whereas our neighbors like Sri Lanka are having 92 and 71st rank. And when it comes to out-of-pocket expenditure, where we spend from our own pockets, we are actually spending around 64%, is one of the highest in the world. So although the government, both the national and the state governments have taken a lot of efforts to actually improve our health systems, but you will be realizing that we are actually starting at a very disadvantage when it comes to COVID-19. So we are not a state, we are not a country where we have a lot of advantages. Now, having said that, there is definitely a regional variation. You have a Kerala and a Tamil Nadu in India, which has as good as any developed country, but you also have a Northeast and the different states which have actually not performed well. So if you ask me what is the sort of a situation in India, we will say our health as a percentage of GDP is still 1.1%. 10 years back, we were still at 1.1%. So we had a lot of schemes, but our health sector has not grown in terms of GDP. Whether you look at the other sectors, whether industry or defense, your percentage as a GDP has gone up much higher. We spend a lot on healthcare, and we have a chaotic public-private mix. You have a corporate hospital, you have a government hospital, you have a private hospital, you have a private clinic. You have heard about quacks, you have heard about religious practitioners, you are seeing public-private partnerships. So it's not something very structured which you are seeing. So India has to deal with these problems. And what government has done in the last 10 years have to reduce the out-of-pocket expenditure, which means that what we spend from our own pocket, they've gone into the insurance model. So 2 years back, we had the Prime Minister Jan Arogya Yojana, which is a national scheme of insurance, but other states, around 21 states started insurance schemes, right, from Arogya Shri in Andhra Pradesh to different states. But the problem in health sector is a different problem. It's not always about money. You may have money, but are you spending it enough? So you look at spending in, say, UP or Rajasthan. If you are given 100 crores, you're only spending 50 crores. The remaining money goes back to the sector, to the country. Whereas you take countries like, or states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu, they are spending quite well. So the spending, not spending, now why that is an absorptive capacity is something which has been debated over a period of time. So just to put you quickly into the healthcare system. So our focus has always been on the tertiary care system. So which is more about hospitalization. So everybody talks about a hospital, corporate hospital, medical colleges, the beds. But I think the last 10 years, the emphasis has sort of slowly declined when it came to primary care and the secondary care. Although in the Ayushman Bharat, there is a health and wellness centers, which has actually given a lot of impetus to the primary care. But this mismatch, like for example, if you look at the budget analysis, you will see that most of the funds actually go into the tertiary care. So this is where COVID has hit us. So that's what I'm going to present today. Now, if you ask me very quickly, so I've said all these points, many of you are aware of it, regional variations, healthcare, manpower and infrastructure are a major concern. If you can handle these two issues in our country, the 50% of your health problems will be over. You don't have manpower in the rural areas. We all know that the specialists which are available are mostly in the headquarters. So there has been studies which have been done, which have said that pediatricians in a state, 70% are only in the headquarters. So for us, 2-3 districts, rural districts, you don't have a pediatrician. You have a high maternal child mortality. You have very bad nutrition. Malnourishment is one of the highest. It's one of the only indicators which has increased over time. So if you take 90s to 2000, your malnutrition rate is only increasing. It's not decreasing. And now we are talking about a communicable and non-communicable. You have a diabetes, you have a hypertension, but you're also talking about COVID, you're talking about tuberculosis. So we have a dual burden right now. So what's the pandemic which has done? I think initially when we started researching on this, we thought 3 months, 4 months will be over. But now we are at 9th month after the first index case in Kerala in end January. Now every state is now grappling with this issue. Reported cases and reported deaths have increased. We have 87 to 90,000 cases per day in India. Recovery rate is one of the highest in the country. Yes, around 80%. And the mortality rate is also not very high. But you still look at a life is a life. And then a lack of population have actually died because of the COVID. When it comes to testing, again, pan-India, it has gone. But if you look at the per million testing, it has actually not been that high in India. So what is that the impact has got into the COVID? So I think this brings to the age-old situation. Wherever states who have a good manpower and infrastructure have done well handling the COVID. You can't change things overnight. I cannot actually shift 10 doctors to a rural district because there's going to be bigger problems. And 3 crucial T's of COVID, I think the tracing, the testing and treatment have to be very important. Now, very interestingly, we were doing some analysis. We found that some states focus on all 3, but there are some states which don't even do a contact tracing. So you can actually walk into any state, spend your time and go out of that state without even having a tracing, whether you're a positive or negative. So that sort of mismatch has happened, whether it comes to testing, whether it comes to treatment, the same thing has happened. Many states have control. Everything is in the headquarters. In my own state in Telangana, we have actually 90% of the testing is in Hyderabad. The remaining 10, all the districts have only 10% of the testing centers. Similar when it comes to the treatment. So we have been arguing that if the situation is going to go bad in the coming days, you are going to have a problem because your districts are not fully covered. And what's happening is now you can see that the rural areas are getting affected. It's not always the headquarters which is getting affected. Now, one of the biggest thing about COVID, I think which everybody initially would have noticed, everybody started grappling for a bed in a hospital. I think COVID doesn't mean everybody needs a hospitalization. It's actually the research shows that only 2% of the total population would actually require an oxygen bed or an ICU or a ventilator. So we actually don't have a shortage there. What actually is important is how do you prevent how do you have a home quarantine? How do you have a public quarantine? Can you put all your people in your house and say that you stay there? Do they have the facilities? We are a very densely populated place. What happens for you have a sore throat? Do you still go to a corporate hospital for that? Or when do you get to have a specialized treatment? So this is where your primary, secondary, tertiary, or referrals come into picture. So what are some of the innovative solutions what states have done? I think Telangana have come out with excellent quarantine kits and guidelines. So they have encouraged home quarantine right from the day one. Many states have actually done that. And many places where you have no home quarantine, they have actually gone with public quarantines. So you have converted factories, function halls, schools, etc. into public quarantine, and proper guidelines are actually given. Even the Ministry of Health has done that. And there are so many states like Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, which have tied up with hotels, because their argument was for hospitals or a home cannot provide you all the care. So you need to have a separate isolation centers. Many states have gone with the railway coaches into the COVID wards. And you have also heard stories of Delhi, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, where robots have now coming into quarantine. Why? Because we don't have manpower. Secondly, we don't want contact. So there is a robot called Mitra, which has been an Indianized version of the robot, which is actually doing tremendous work. There's a lot of community engagement which has happened in Kerala and MP, where the self-help groups, the Kudumbashree, the local self-government, the rural development, the police department have actually worked together with the health department to handle this crisis. Now, when it comes to basic hospital treatment, do you really want to run to a private hospital? No. So you don't need, or a government medical college? No. You have to have a first level treatment centers, and only 10% of your entire COVID requires a specialized treatment. So they will only have a mild symptoms. So you need to treat them in different healthcare facilities. And now we have an entire set of facilities. Like you have all heard about Mohalla clinics in Delhi or Basti Davakhanas in Telangana. Now what has happened is, whichever the government has already set up, those institutions have become now testing centers, treatment centers, which has actually helped us. The health and wellness centers have really helped us. The community health centers have really helped us. And Kerala was one of the first states to have the first level treatment centers. And even in one district, they had 25,000 beds allotted for a first level treatment center. So you are actually not pushing your tertiary care centers. So these are some of the models there. And when it comes to specialized, as I said, only 6 to 8% of the total cases would require a specialized treatment. So you need to actually, the problem now is what for government and the states are to set up more institutions at the district level. So you need to have your manpower shifted. So a lot of activities are going on now in that point, like because we have shortage of doctors, we have shortage of nurses. So can we convert our final year students, MBBS students, dental students to go for such, they can give them training and send them to districts. So what is the policy option? So definitely health is going to be a priority. So earlier we used to say, like defense, like the economy, health is going to be a priority. But we have to also learn with the life with COVID. I think we have to have a new normal. We have to learn from innovations. I think a lot of states have shown us tremendous innovations, whether it's Kerala, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Delhi. I think tremendous innovations. A lot of failures have happened, but we have to look. A lot of budgets have to be increased. I think what are the problems which we have faced is we never invested in the health sector. So we need to actually invest in your healthcare, both at the primary care, secondary care, and the tertiary care. Role of private sector. Now, everybody talks about private sector charging quite high, but the counter question is, you always not talk only about the corporate sector. You also talk about what happens in testing. What happens if the private sector tomorrow says we are not going to do COVID treatment? We will be in a bigger trouble. Initially, government said we will do it ourselves, but now every state has now tried to work with the private sector. So it's all about a stewardship. How to bring in the private sector together. We understand they do charge but understanding their needs, having a proper packages, fixing their prices, controlling the private sector effectively, we can actually do a much better job. So basically, because this is a national emergency, and we are not looking at public sector versus private sector here, we need to work together. And what are the other policy options? I think we need to look at the health manpower. This is the right time to incentivize. You cannot expect the frontline doctors. Every day one doctor is losing a life. Every day one nurse is losing a life. So you need to incentivize them. You have to give them additional salary. You have to take care of your frontline workers. You have to properly you have to encourage home healthcare. People have now realized the fact that you don't go to a hospital for everything. People are discouraging. Doctors are discouraging you from going to a medical college unless you have a real problem. So home healthcare is going to come up. Now your diagnostics are happening at home. Your medicines are reaching at your home. So now tomorrow your treatment may also come at your home. So home healthcare is going to come. Telemedicine is going to come up in a big way. Referrals, people only if you need, you go to a super specialty hospital. And I would say that one of the key aspects here is your health communication. people, it is not about printing posters about COVID. It's about how do you effectively wear a mask, how do you effectively do a social distancing. What lockdown has actually helped us is actually to give that communication. People are now at least aware, although I would still say many people have still not adhered in some states, but people generally now understand mask is useful. If you wear a mask, you are protecting, your risk is quite a bit, 70-75% you are averting the risk. So those things are very, very important. So we have a lot of national digital health missions. We have national digital innovations. You need to bring in technology. You have to bring in telemedicine. You don't need to go to hospital. Doctors sitting in headquarters can actually treat you. I think these are going to be the future. But don't forget about Ayush and holistic. Right now, Government of India has not agreed for treatment by these for COVID. But in the coming days, immunity is going to be very important. How do you save yourself from immunity? You need to have your holistic care. And the last but not the least, please do not forget about the mental health. I think COVID has brought this into the main fact, your depression, your fear psychosis, loss of job. We are talking about lives, you're also talking about livelihoods. So mental health is going to become a very, very big area of concern and area where everybody is going to focus in the coming days. I'm sure we'll overcome this crisis. I've only raised a few points, but at the end of the day, ensuring health is our next step. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Subodh, for really giving us the insight of the health sector in India, and also bringing in a lot of other ideas. How do you view the telemedicine, which is going to come in a big way? People are to be educated. People are to be told to take basic necessary advices which World Health Organization gives you. Like everybody has to look at to what are the systems which are being evolved in order to go along the state, and how the state is going to loop in or bring in a lot of new directives in order to see that the population also really cares for their health. And health has really become till yesterday it was military sector or the defense which was more important. Now we have a non-traditional threat, like now you have to really focus on to the health and health sector taking the real center of gravity for each state. I hope everybody might be noting the questions for Professor Subodh. We'll take up later on. And now we have Dr. Santesh Kumar Singh, who is an associate professor in Department of Political Science at Central Institute of Haryana, India, and he will be speaking on COVID-19 and global health diplomacy, a strategy option. I request Santesh Kumar sir to kindly speak for 10 minutes, since we are really have a strong crunch of time. So please adhere the time.
Liaquat sir, you are giving very difficult task for us to conclude in 10 minutes, but surely I will try my best.
We are in difficult times, so we have to take care of ourselves also. So kindly do that.
At every step we are facing that.
Yeah.
From COVID to this webinar too. No? The webinar has also emerged as a problem for us, and we are facing that. We are taking classes online.
Your paper of opportunity is more important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Over to Dr. Sandesh Kumar.
Thank you.
Yeah.
First of all, I would like to thank WPC for inviting me to share my thoughts on given topic which I am going to speak on. And Rao Saab have been in constant touch with me during these last few weeks regarding this webinar. So I will extend my thanks to him. And also I would like to thank Aruna Shinde ma'am. She has also been in touch with me during this last few weeks regarding this program and scheduling and all these. So without taking too much time, I would like to share my PPT. So today I'm going to speak on basically Is it visible? Is it visible?
Yes, yes, yes. It's visible. Go ahead. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is what I'm going to speak on: COVID-19 and global health diplomacy, a strategic opportunity for India. And here, this, now we are facing this COVID-19 crisis, and which has been, officially declared by, China on 31st December 2019. Since then, we are listening this term so many times, and this is what threatening us till now, and we're not able to get any medicine or any vaccine till now. So we don't know how long it will take to get resolve this problem. So definitely we are going to live with this. A lot of people are talking about post COVID world and post COVID world order and all this, but I don't think there will be any post COVID world, because it will be there in with us for longer time. So we have to live with this. We can't say like it is going to be end. It will be there definitely. In the days to come, we are going to get medicines and all this. So without taking too much time, I would like to say, like global health diplomacy has been one of the important term in last 2-3 decades. Because a few days back I was reading one of the report of CSIS US. In that report, it was mentioned like in 1980s, less than 100 times it was being searched on in basically on internet. But in 1990s, it was like in thousands. But in 21st century, the term global health diplomacy has been searched more than million times. So this has one of the most popularized word nowadays in international politics and international relations. And a lot of research is also been done in this, and also going on at the same time. So the country US has been one of the prominent country in propagating the concept of global health diplomacy, and followed by European Union and Japan and other countries too, like China is also in race, but other country have not yet decided their global health policy, global health diplomacy policy. But India is in the process to adopt that. I'm not saying it has, still it hasn't, but in the days to come, in the years to come, we are going to have global health diplomacy policy. So this is, I'm going to read few of the PPTs which is directly linked with my topic. Like one of the very recognized preeminent diplomat, Robert Cooper, once said, it was enough for a nation to look with after itself. Today it is no longer sufficient. This is particularly true in the health arena. There is an increasing range of health issues that transcend national boundaries and require action on the global forces and determine the health of people. The broad political, social, and economic implications of health issues have brought more diplomats into the health arena and more public health experts into the world of diplomacy. Simple classifications of policy and politics, domestic and foreign, hard and soft, high and low, no longer apply. This is what we have witnessed in the last few years. And diplomacy, I'm not going to read all the definitions, but definitely Kissinger is known for this, a specific method for compromise and consensus, and a system of organization within a legitimate international order called diplomacy. Means it is a process through which countries try to maximize their own national interests through engagement, dialogues, and deliberations. And then what is global health diplomacy? That is what we have to understand. And global health diplomacy is as is all diplomacy and essentially political process, and as health again becomes politically more relevant in domestic and in foreign policy and at the global level, health diplomacy plays an increasingly important role. It can be summarized as, firstly, global health diplomacy occupies the interface between international health assistance and international political relations. Secondly, most definitions highlight that negotiations are at the heart of global health diplomacy. Thirdly, the existence of multiple levels of negotiations and participation of diverse actors is also an important component of global health diplomacy. And different dimensions of global health diplomacy we have recognized are basically a method for reaching compromise and consensus in matters pertaining to health, usually in the face of other interests, power, security, economic interests, but also to values and principles. In bilateral geopolitical contexts, a soft power strategy using health for foreign policy goals, including security. It has emerged as an important tool of soft power policies for the countries. In crisis situation, a bridge to peace. It is being used by countries to establish peace building and peacemaking processes. And dimensions of global health can be summarized as humanitarian, economic, and security. These three are important components of global health diplomacy, and countries are propagating these three important dimensions of global health diplomacy. All the developed nations are playing vital role in eradicating the health problems from the developing and LDCs by implementing of many programs through multilateral organizations and individual efforts. Health is a key area of economic policy of developed countries, but yet to find its due place in the developing countries. Investment in the research and development of health sectors in developing countries provides healthy environment, which translate into vibrant markets for the goods and services. For example, out of top 10 pharmaceutical companies, 6 belongs to US. So this is what one of the example we have to see. How US and this security dimension is also there. It is one of the important component we have realized since 1990s. While we got the concept of human security, basically a lot of issues are being incorporated in the concept of national security, because the conventional, which clearly talks about, includes basically diplomatic and military security to maintain the sovereignty and integrity of the country. While in non-conventional, it has elaborated a lot of things like economic disorders and communicable diseases breaking out in any part of the world. And it has included the plague outbreak like we have experienced in 1990s in India, and the SARS outbreak in China in 2003, and the other, a lot of outbreaks have taken place in last 2 decades, and in continuation of that, this COVID-19 also part of that. We can see like how COVID-19 have become a national security threat for the countries. So in that reference, 2 countries are considering COVID-19 as important thing to be considered for national security policies. So it is not directly linked with the health system only, it is linked with your state security too. A whole range of diverse global issues have raised the highest level of political concerns, promoting governmental and international institutions to tackle such health threats through the prism of security, be it national security, biosecurity, or human security. Over the past decade, all the nations have renewed its efforts to address large-scale incidents that have threatened human health, such as disease outbreaks like severe SARS, H1N1 influenza, and this COVID-19 too. India as a donor nation, this is what we are witnessing now. Since the beginning of 21st century, India was a recipient country, but now it has turned its policy and become a donor country. India's development assistance policy upheld principles of non-alignment, moralism, and human dignity. India's development assistance was rooted in concerns over geopolitical stability when it comes offered aid to its South Asian neighbors. As the country liberalized its economy in 1990s, the moral foundations of foreign aid began to diminish. Continued this, India's programs are different from those of many traditional donors. Their assistance programs are primarily demand-driven and request-based. Additionally, India delivers assistance mainly on a bilateral basis rather than a collaboration with other countries or international organizations. India relies on bilateralism. Development terms such as donor and aid preferring to view its development assistance programs as a form of South-South partnership. Characteristics of Indian aid policy. First, most of India's aid is given within its neighborhood. Its aid allocation is still largely concentrated on South Asian countries. 89.7% of total aid provided by MEA in the 2010. I'm giving old data, but the same trend is still here. Almost 80% has been given to neighboring countries. Second, India is more likely to provide aid to countries at a similar development stage. India believes that it is in a better position to understand the developmental needs of its peers. Third, India's political and commercial self-interest plays an exceptional role in its aid allocation decisions. For India used aid as a foreign policy tool when it cut aid to the Maldives over a political investment dispute. Indian health diplomacy, this is what new trend we have witnessed from a recipient to donor. India is moving away from net recipient status to net donor status. In 2003, India announced that it would continue to accept bilateral assistance from only selected countries and the European Union. These selected countries means I'm talking about only US. India is receiving the donation or aid from US and European Union only. Before this, India was accepting the assistance from several countries, but now India has denied and declined. So between 1967 to 2010, net official development assistance received as percentage of gross national income in India dropped from 2.79% to 0.17. This is what India has changed actually. Now India have stopped taking money from countries in the name of assistance and aid, indicating the shift to net donor status could derive in a few years. To better manage its economic aid and assistance Two friendly countries, the Indian government operationalized the Development Partnership Administration (DPA), a new division in the Ministry of External Affairs in March 2012. This is what India have established within its apparatus, foreign policy apparatus. The fact that DPA division is located in the Ministry of External Affairs, so it is in sync with our foreign policy objectives of transforming India into a global player. India is also keen that its development assistance programs are different from the traditional donor recipient relationship, and hence the states on development partnership. Recently, India has increased its foreign assistance budget, and total assistance grew from an estimated $443 million in 2002 to $680 million in 2010. India also has dispensed significant resources, donating medicines, diagnostics, ambulances, health infrastructure, development, other supplies to recipient countries. Indian health diplomacy is strategic engagement in the world. This is what I'm reading this year. Motives of India's global health diplomacy behind foreign assistance is three: humanitarian, strategic, and economic. This is why I have been noticed why India is so keen in basically global diplomacy, why it is moving towards basically global diplomacy. This is what I found, like it has three different dimensions: humanitarian, strategic, and economic. In the case of Nepal and Bhutan, whatever India is doing is basically humanitarian somehow, but in the case of strategic security, we can see we have example of Afghanistan. India is deeply involved in that country because of strategic interests and security interests. And economic, like African countries, India is investing a lot of money in African continent, definitely to get economic benefit. So this is what we have witnessed in last few years. In last 2 decades, India is moving towards. Like here you can see the table: humanitarian, ensuring health security in Nepal. India is one of the important bilateral partner of Nepal in development and growth of basically Nepal, and restructuring Nepal and other aspects of Nepal. So here we can see like India is involved in several things in projects. You can see, I'm not going to read all the projects. Like India is providing ambulance and establishing hospitals, clinics, and all these, with other projects too. And this strategic ensuring health security in Afghanistan, here you can see like India places more than $2 billion in reconstruction assistance to Afghanistan, which is highest after Bangladesh. Bangladesh is one of the highest recipient country from India, and after Bangladesh, Afghanistan is the second highest, largest recipient country of India. The majority of health projects in Afghanistan funded by India have budgets between $20,000 and $3, in between this $3 million. India rises as a third largest development partner of Afghanistan in total, while we compare with other countries. You can see the year wise, like 2006 to 2016-17, how India has been involved in giving assistance to Afghanistan, and role of countries for peace building in Afghanistan. Here we can see like India is one of the important component in this peace building process of Afghanistan. India have contributed almost 5% of total assistance to Afghanistan. And here also can see the total assistance of India's to Afghanistan. Health is very less, but it's also important component, like 2.17% budget of total assistance of India to Afghanistan is given to basically health sector. So health sector has also been considered one of the important component by government of India, just giving assistance to Afghanistan. Here I have given few of the examples what India is giving to them, like daily supply of 100 grams of fortified high protein biscuits to nearly 2 million children under a school feeding program, and gift of 250,000 metric tons of wheat announced in January 2009, free medical consultation and medicines through 5 Indian medical missions, reconstruction of Indira Gandhi Institute of Child Health in Kabul, gifting of vehicles, 5 toilet public sanitation complexes in Kabul. Capacity building programs is also underway in the fields of healthcare and medical sciences with other fields. IGICH and the Malalai Hospital in Kabul are linked with reputed Indian hospitals through a SARC telemedicine project. So these are the things. Here I have also given detailed information about that: setting up a basic health clinic, setting up a comprehensive health center, construction of child hospital, construction of gynecology clinic, construction of basic health clinic in context of health development. And these are things India is doing in Afghanistan. At the same time, India is also promoting M-tourism, through which Afghanistan getting benefit of this relationship with India. India's initiative in Africa, we can see here, this is very much concentrated on economic front, and India and Africa reaffirmed their commitment to enhance collaboration and share experiences in the application of advancement in science, technology, research and development to training in the area of HIV, TB, malaria, Ebola, polio, COVID-19. In addition to being a source of income, however, deployment of health workers has also long served as a means for developing countries to project soft power worldwide. India deployed almost 56,000 health workers in 2000 across globe. So India's pharmaceutical industry continues to have enormous global impact. Like in Ethiopia, India's countries are also investing a lot of money in other countries too, not only in Ethiopia. I'm talking about in East African countries. India is deeply involved in this health sector. Here we can see like how much India's outward FDI to Africa in pharmaceutical industry. You can see year-wise, 2008 to 2014, it is increasing like 50.90 million dollars to 67.40 million US dollar. So this is what India is doing. India's pharmaceutical exports to Africa, you can see here in this figure, it is increasing per year. So we can see like from 2000 to 2040, it has done major jump is there in basically these exports to Africa, pharmaceutical exports to Africa. This is why why India is so keen in investing basically Africa. These are the programs through which India is trying to maximize its national interest to, under this global health diplomacy policy. The programs are namely basically Focus Africa program, Team 9 initiative, Pan Africa e-network and health sector, and telemedicine, hospitals and health centers in Africa, medical tourism, African tourist arrival in India for medical treatment in the year of 2013. These are things. And below I have given a table, the country bilateral assistance in terms of basically pharmaceutical sector. We can see like there's good number India is investing in basically pharmaceutical sector with the bilateral countries, bilaterally basically with the countries. India's health diplomacy, why India is so keen in going into basically global health diplomacy policy? Because of India is one of the important hub of international market in one of the highest, largest producer of generic manufacturing, a rich heritage of traditional medicine, Ayurveda, Siddha, Unani, large health service, human resources, doctors, nurses, we are having manufacturing, provision of healthcare services such as hospitals, medical education, global regime, WTO, and research and development. Areas of strategic benefit for India through global health diplomacy. Market consideration, we have huge market, that's why India can exploit its market through the global diplomacy. Expanding middle class, India's middle class, one of the highest in world. So it can be one important market for the developed countries too. They can come here, invest, they can we can get FDI and FI from the developed countries in this pharmaceutical sector and health sector. Rise of diseases, that is one of the causes. India's health sector is also in demand. Pharmaceuticals, growth of telemedicine, deteriorating health infrastructure, lack of insurance, emerging health insurance market, medical tourism on the rise, medical equipment market, pharmaceutical industry opportunities. A lot of things are there. India is considering global health diplomacy as one of the important component of its foreign policy making. India's health diplomacy during COVID-19 crisis. There are 2-3 slides more, sir. So I think I'll be able to conclude very soon. India, under the able and dynamic leadership of Sri Narendra Modi, is at the forefront to fight against COVID-19 by sending medicine a team of doctors, medical equipment, and rescue operations of standard foreign nationals in India. From SARC to G20 countries, India has taken the command in addressing the situation effectively. The unprecedented coronavirus crisis has united the SARC countries as they adopted international travel bans. A lot of things are being done to contain the spread of coronavirus in this region. Basically, ever since the South Asian region experienced the first wave of COVID-19, India has been actively engaging with SARC nations by supporting them. Not only these SARC nations, with other countries too, in other continents too, in this deeply involved. With the critical medical supplies like hand sanitizers, forehead sensors, PPE, surgical masks, and so on. So to ensure global food security, India has delivered food grain stocks to countries like Afghanistan, Lebanon upon request. The export of anti-malaria drug, HCQ, to almost 60 countries around the world, including the permanent members of United Nations Security Council. Even India has provided assistance to US too. India has provided medical assistance with neighboring countries on priority basis like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Maldives. It also revoked the partial ban on exporting some generic medicines, including HCQ, depending on humanitarian COVID situation, upon request by United States and Brazil. So this is what India is doing in this continent. India has been an active, responsible state actor in reaching out, be it intimating virtual SARC meeting and creating the creating the COVID-19 Emergency Fund or the country's roles in the G20 Leaders Summit and recent BRICS and NAM meetings. As part of its simulating aid, India placed $10 million for SARC Coronavirus Emergency Fund. Subsequently, Nepal and Afghanistan please use the $1 billion. Each Maldives committed 2 lakhs US dollar, Bhutan 1 lakhs, Bangladesh 1.5 million, Sri Lanka 5 million, Pakistan 3 million, but India has contributed more than $10 million to this fund. Subcontinental giant India has also been sending its medical health professionals and offering technical assistance to various countries across the Asian region to supplement their efforts against the deadly virus. Amid this crisis, Indian medical experts are providing online health training and are exchanging valuable information to contain the virus. Apart from its medical assistance, India is running missions like Vande Bharat mission. It is still going on, through which India is trying to carrying out rescue operations, basically, so that India can, even in not only Indians living outside of India, even those who are people of basically neighboring countries living outside of this region, Maldives and from Maldives and Bangladesh and even Pakistan also being offered by India to get assistance under this Vande Bharat mission. So India is assessing, and this INS Kesari has been used to ferry medical teams, medicine supplies to countries in Indian Ocean, such as Maldives, Madagascar, Mauritius, Comoros, and Seychelles. So these countries are getting assistance, and this is conclusion. I'm going to read a few slides. It can be easily identified that global diplomacy constitutes a key part in foreign policy decision making. Global diplomacy and its interface with international politics opens new vistas in the academic discourse. It is not without reason that India's development assistance programs are concentrated in countries or regions that could give India resources and energy like Africa and Central Asia. The role of India in healthcare sector should be explored for universal health coverage. India's engagement in global health diplomacy needs to be formulated and implemented not only to generate revenue, but also to have an increased global political engagement. India cannot wait for pandemic to occur like SARS, Tegas, Ebola, Zika, and definitely this we have all witnessing this COVID-19 world to examine and develop a comprehensive foreign policy, promoting soft power. These are the issues. I'm going to read the last slide. India's effort in combating this pandemic gathered much praise across the globe. Extraordinary times requires even closer cooperation between friends. Thank you, India, and the Indian people for the decision on SCQ will not be forgotten. Thank you, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, for your strong leadership in helping not just India, but humanity in this fight. These were the praising words by the American President Donald Trump in his tweet to Narendra Modi. This is one of the success of this global diplomacy, India's global diplomacy policy. Brazilian President Bolsonaro drew a parallel to Hanumanji. He has quoted in one of the tweets for providing Sanjeevani Booty and saving the lives of its citizens. Benjamin Netanyahu was all but full of praising words for India's efforts in sending the requisite consignment in no time. This is the few examples I'm quoting here. A lot of people have also praised India's initiative in fight against COVID-19. So through this global health diplomacy policy, India is trying to maximize its image through soft power under the soft power initiatives. And India is trying to maximize its national interests. There's no doubt, but at the same time, India is playing one of the important player as an humanitarian country too. So that's all, sir. If there will be any question, definitely I will.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Santesh Kumar for giving us Santesh Kumar for giving us a lot of thought-provoking ideas, and this also has provoked many questions into like how do you see global health diplomacy amongst the South Asian countries? The South Asian countries are not very well integrated, according to many scholars. Like many scholars also do agree that India would be happy to help the states like Iran. It would be happy to help states in Europe, but into the neighboring countries, it has a difficult time. The neighborhood policy was also very important.
Yeah.
And thereby, you see lot of questions coming onto whether India would be able to really integrate with respect to health sector diplomacy in the neighborhood, and will it be able to help the neighboring countries and integrate further? And the economy also will see this economy coming onto this platform. Now, since we are running out of time, I will request Dr. Koel Basu, who is an assistant professor Department of Policy Science, Jangipur College, like she would be speaking on COVID-19 and digital rights violations in times of trial, and this becomes very important to hear. Like what kind of digital rights that we are talking of? Are we really talking of entering into a lot of space? Because nowadays what is happening, like since everything is going on online, the time schedule has changed. Like earlier, where we had 9 to 5 job, you suddenly see that people have started asking you to come online in the evening, in the night. Like now the time which earlier was fixed, now that has been stretched from 9 to 5. Now you can explore and say. And in Mumbai, lot of corporates are right now saying to their fellow people that you don't have to travel, so you just have to open the laptop and then you have to work. So there is a very strong question that do we have our rights, and what kind of rights that we are talking with respect to space, with respect to digital democracy or digital state. So with this, we would like to hear from Koel Basu on digital rights, and kindly please adhere to that 10 minutes time so that we can have much more time to discuss and have a lot of good thought-provoking questions. Over to Dr. Koel Basu. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible and visible?
Yeah. You are
I want to share my screen. First of all, I want to thank YPC for giving me this opportunity on this August platform. My topic for today is COVID-19 and digital rights, violation in times of trial. Now, is my screen visible?
Yes, it's visible now. You can go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Now, very warm welcome to everyone watching this on whatever platform possible for you to watch it. Now, today we are having a lot of important discussion on various aspects and how pandemic has overwhelmed us, transformed us. But one thing which is very important is the digital dynamics, which remains unexplored. Now, I want to explore that how the digital landscape is changing due to COVID-19 pandemic, which is one of the most extraordinary events in the last 100 years, which is called the Black Swan event famously. Now, what are digital rights and why do we need them? Now, digital rights are legal rights of individuals to access, use, create and publish digital media. So there is a legal aspect to it, which is very important. Since October 2019, we have seen that how the UN has been emphasizing, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights have been emphasizing on digital rights much before the pandemic, because we have seen countries clamping down on rights of people in the digital space. So legally, apart from the legal importance, there is basic human rights question that comes in, because digital rights are human rights, which is very important to know, because it is a public good. And just like electricity, it has now become much important, because against the backdrop of the pandemic, we are understanding, renewing how things have gone online, whether education, whether activities, whether grassroots movements, everything has now has gone online, whether environmental activism. So it's very important to know that digital rights are extremely important. With that comes the question of privacy, whether we have online privacy or not. Freedom of expression is being curtailed nowadays. We know how social media is handling the crisis and how government is clamping down on social media. So according to UN, disconnecting people from the internet is something which goes against the international law. It has been mentioned in several parts of UN documents that how and why digital rights are important, because people have the right to data protection. What they are sharing, it can't be mishandled by the government without their consent or without their agreeing upon that. It is being sold or shared, they have the right to know. So in the age of telemedicines and critical healthcare policies also being known through internet. So it is a part of right to life. And here I have shared the quote from Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, how it is important and there is a need for oversight, accountability and responsibility on the part of government when we are talking about digital rights. Now, how COVID-19 has changed digital rights landscape. Now, this is extremely important because we know that COVID-19 is something which has not only affected the health of individuals and renewed importance in health, but every aspect, whether it's geopolitics, geoeconomics, every aspect of life has changed, whether it's education, everything. So how we have seen the weakening of freedom of expression and how in case of democracy, this is very important because free flow of information, there are RTIs being made regarding the right to know. We have the right to know what is we are posting and how it is being used. Recent spat between Facebook and the government is an example. I'm not going into the details of that, and how the Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg has apologized many a times and said that he's going to look into it, how it has been shared over and over again, the data of people without they knowing that. Lack of internet access, the digital divide, we can talk about that. Just like rural urban divide, it's there is a lot of inequitable connectivity. People can't connect properly, and there is a question of affordability also. So digital exclusion, we can see in through various internet in various countries through internet shutdowns. Now, due to paucity of times, and I cannot go into the details of it, but we know about how in India, the Kashmir media policy is running. And we know that from August 2019, how media has been excluded into delving deep into government policies. They have settled down with 2G connectivity. There has been protest instead of 4G connectivity. Doctors have been shut out from, telling about the crisis. And in Pakistan also, in tribal districts where online education goes on, how this is happening. This is very poignant to know. In Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, where thousands and thousands of Rohingya refugees are there. Elderly people don't know because of what is happening, the measures, social distancing norms, hand washing norms, because of shutting down of internet. And to talk about public health disinformation. Now, this is a crisis that we are going through, and we know that how UN chief has said about the misinfodemic, how misinformation is raging through. And there is a slight difference between misinformation and disinformation. With malevolent intention, when information is forced to run, that is disinformation, and there is a political motive in it. Fake cures abound in the internet. In Namibia, elephant dung has been used, is being told that it is a coronavirus cure and sold online at exorbitant prices. In Argentina, chlorine dioxide is being given as a corona cure. In Iran, salt is being said to be a cure. I mean, we know in India how politicians have talked about COVID cures, like from papar to walking barefoot in the mud. So all these things are happening, and in social media video also it happened. A seed named Datura was hailed as a coronavirus cure, and people became ill after consuming it. And apart from that, there are numerous examples. I'm not going into it, but we know how disinformation is spreading, and with that, public health surveillance is going on. It's not I'm saying I'm against what government is saying. I'm against that. A kind of a certain amount of surveillance is needed as a containment measure for the pandemic, but in the name of surveillance, in the pretext of containing the pandemic, a lot of information is going, and when going to the government, and we don't know what is happening to the information, whether it is being permanently used or distorted for some other intention, which is not right. And data monitoring and censorship is going on. In Karnataka, uploading of selfies was said to be a measure to contain the pandemic. And because of this, what is happening is that a lot of stigmatization and xenophobia is going on. Nurses are being attacked, doctors are being thrown out by landlords from their rented apartments. So this is something which is not something that is very encouraging. Now, there is what is happening is communication cease. There is a lot of digital inequality, and because of that, there is no room for dialogue, dissent, and activism. In Algeria, we know what is happening. Democracy is in crisis, and there is a lot of discrimination, hate speech that is going on in the internet in name of digital freedom, which is something which we have to look into, and that is getting a communal flavor also. We know about the Tablighi Jamaat case and others, which I'm not going deep into it. And a lot of things are being said about the media. For example, a reporter was attacked on social media because he was exposing the plight of the Mushar community, how they were surviving on grass due to a sudden clamping of lockdown. So this is one of the examples. A lot of repression. So what is happening? The diversity, which is the essence of democracy, that is being subverted. Now, what we have to do is that all is which is being done by the government is not bad. I'm not saying that. A lot of encouragement, social awareness campaigns are also happening. For example, civil servants are working for example, in Jharkhand district. Chatbots are used to make villagers aware of what is happening. So digital literacy in schools are very important. From schools, we started education. So it has to be inclusive and not exclusive, and surveillance free and safe and equitable for all. So sharing information and assisting with diagnosis using internet for the, because it is the prime currency now, using internet for the for all, and there should be egalitarian distribution, and focus on communities without access to internet. And there are communities who are they don't have internet access. We should government should focus on that, and they should rope in civil society organization and media for this. And obviously, digital space should be used to remove abusive and restrictive cultural norms. A lot of domestic violence cases have been happening due to the pandemic, so it should be used to encourage women to come out in protest of that, so that digital protest can happen also. So these are the things which can, apart from the pitfalls, there is a good side of it, why it should digital space, freedom on digital space should be encouraged. So I think that so I think that in these difficult times, digital governance, proper internet governance is required from the government. And we hope that digital colonization, which is separating people from one another, can be avoided. I think I've concluded. Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Koel, for making a very, very potent presentation.
And I think I've stuck to the time, sir. I think I've stuck.
Yeah, you have done. Yeah. So we have got enough time to take on some questions from the audience. Before I open up, again I would request Professor Neeraj Hatekar, is he there, so that he can make his presentation? Has he come, Professor Neeraj Hatekar?
No, sir.
He has not come. So okay, we will take one round of questions. Like kindly, if there are any questions, you can put to any of the panelists. By the time everybody thinks of some questions, I would like to have one first question to Professor Fulu. Is he there, Professor Fulu Netsuera, who spoke on various global concerns? Is he there, Professor Fulu?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Let us have first round of question, and since you are the first person to begin, the first question to you would be, and like, how do you see the unemployment rate regarding unemployment, which is the developing world is facing in a large scale, like whether education system will be able to get employment, or whether there will be some difficulties apart from education institutions getting along with the states, but not solving the problem of unemployment, because they have a very strong role to play with respect to states. So what is your opinion regarding unemployment growing and education? Yeah. Over to Professor Flu.
Thank you very much, Professor Khan, for the question. I do not know if you mean education and unemployment in relation to COVID pandemic or irrespective. But in any case, let me try. I think, of course, we have seen that unemployment has increased drastically all over the world, and it has hit different countries differently. The developing nations are suffering greatly at the moment because of COVID-19. So a lot of small businesses had to close down. So the devastation is huge. But I would assume that this will prevail for the shortest period possible. If a cure was to be found in the coming month or two, I think things might normalize once more. And in the coming year or so, we will see unemployment slowly getting addressed. Now, the role of education continues to be central to addressing unemployment generally, in general terms. Now, the most important question is, how do we make sure that education and relevant education reaches everybody? Education that is instrumental and fundamental to eradicating unemployment, so that all individuals are given skills, capabilities, and capacity to function optimally by providing labor, by establishing their own startups, and by becoming innovative. And I think online learning, I think other technological innovations in the space of education are making that possible. Thank you, Professor Khan.
Yeah. Further related to again the same idea, that health sector education will definitely bring in large number of people to look after their own communities, because unless until the health sector education improves, they won't be able to get along. What is your opinion, Professor Fulu?
Thank you, Prof. Khan. I think health education, I don't know how you do it in India, but I think in South Africa it's extremely formalized. So I think we need to get to a stage where we make sure that health education is not as formalized as it currently is, so that communities, especially in the rural areas, in the villages, are able to access proper education about health through informal programs, through, I think online learning can work, but also mobile devices can also give very powerful and useful.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Professor Fulu, for that very short answer. Now we have. I would like to ask Professor Subodh sir to kindly give us some inputs onto whether do you still feel that the home quarantine education will further be be one of the very important goal in India, because we have a large population and they cannot be stationed into houses, because in Mumbai, if you see, like in each house there are 10 to 15 people, and then how do you quarantine those 15 people? That is what the Mumbai problem is. Whether the same problem is there with the other states also. Yeah, over to Professor Subodh. Yeah. Kindly unmute, Subodh. Professor Subodh, kindly unmute. You are not able to unmute yourself. Amruta, kindly help if you can.
Yes, can
Yes,
you hear me
yeah.
now? Yes. Yeah.
Go
So I think you're fully correct. I think if you look at the strategy which Kerala adopted when the migrants or the foreign people started coming in, they said the same thing. Kerala is a very densely populated state. How do you allow everybody to stay at home? We will create public facilities, and they actually created public facilities in the beginning. But then what happens is, in the public facility, after a point of time, this becomes difficult to manage. Like, for example, Karnataka started with it because the more number of people, then the state also finds it very difficult to manage those public facilities, because it also requires, it's not that you can automatically do it. So then there was a question which the government had to decide whether to go for a fully funded public facility where government funds and keeps them for 14 days, or then we charge them for 14 days, or allow the people to go and stay in their own houses. So then that option was given to them. So wherever they could go and stay in the house, they could actually go and stay in their houses. So some states said, no, we'll forcefully send them to houses because we don't have that facility of public quarantine. Like, for example, take a state like Telangana, our quarantine beds or the isolation beds are only 17,000. Whereas compared to other states where we have 3 lakhs or 4 lakhs. So depending on the states, availability of beds, the infrastructure availability, they have gone with this decision. I fully agree that home quarantine has its own challenge. The moment, like for example, what Kerala does is that if you goes to one house where you are quarantined, the family who is already there have to relocate somewhere else. So you are not allowed to stay with them, and the health workers keep visiting you. So it all depends on how you manage. Kerala did it much more in a structured way, whereas states like Telangana, we had no other option but to send them to home quarantine, which has its own challenges. You created a hotspot, you create a quarantine area, a containment zone, and then put them into the home quarantine. So it all depends up to the states how it is. But detailed guidelines are available for both, for public as well as home.
Thank you, Professor Subodh, for giving this very, very, very answer in the nutshell of how Kerala and Tamil Nadu are doing its own work onto the home quarantine and the public quarantine, because we in Mumbai are facing the real problem of both. And now we would like to ask one question which comes to my mind to Professor Santesh. Santesh, is he there? He's there. So how can global health diplomacy be one of the touching point in the South Asian diplomacy? Now, South Asia SAARC has definitely a real problem. And how do we go on, or how do you go ahead? Because until you have support to integrate, this becomes a cause, and this is a cause where the cause should be taken in a right spirit in order to integrate the region. What is your view on this particular thing?
Definitely. As I have already said, like, global health diplomacy is one of the important component of soft power policies of any country, not only of India. Basically, all the countries across globe is propagating themselves as basically humanitarian countries, including India too. Definitely, this is very tough time for this South Asian region, because we are having a very bad experience with neighboring countries. There's no doubt. But this COVID-19 has given us a chance to re-establish our relationship with neighboring countries, and India is doing that very nicely, because while we reported the first case of COVID-19 and was being declared on March 11th, I think, WHO had declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. Since then, India has proactively engaged with neighboring countries in helping them basically through providing a lot of assistance. It has provided assistance basically in Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka. Means all the countries are being given assistance by India, even not bilaterally. Even in SAARC too, India have happily contributed huge amount to basically for a COVID-19 emergency fund. So India have shown like as a humanitarian country and as a humanitarian neighboring country of this region, of the countries of this region. So definitely it can play a important role in bridging the gap what we are experiencing last few years with, like in the case of India, Nepal, in the case of India, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, in the case of India, Bangladesh. We are having, there's some gaps, no doubt, but this is an opportunity which India can grab. So India is trying to, no doubt, for example, while India have started running its mission, Vande Bharat mission, India offered all the neighboring countries to come together so that we could bring back our people living outside of this region. So Bangladesh joined India and Maldives joined India, but Pakistan declined at the time. Even Modi ji called a meeting, virtual meeting of neighboring countries, head of the neighboring countries, but Pakistan declined to join that. One of the leaders joined, but Imran Khan have denied that. So the problem is there. Definitely, we have historical problems where the root of problem is there in history. So definitely, it's very tough task for any country, not only for India, for Bangladesh, for Nepal, for this Pakistan. All the countries are having the problem because a lot of things are motivating and driving their domestic politics. So that's why I think this country is not going closer basically to resolve their problems. So but through this global diplomacy and soft power initiatives, all these countries can come together and can help basically people, common people. I'm thinking that is more important in my perspective. Like people have no objection to have good relationship with the neighboring countries. So I think government should work in that direction, whether they are having good relationship government wise or not, but people wise we should go further. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Sandesh, for giving us this wonderful idea. Now there is one last question which comes up for Dr. Koyal Basu, that now you see there are a lot of issues with online privacy, and thereby the state of India is really suffering. Why I say suffering is because it is not able to go ahead with all the laws and implement those laws of privacy in order to curtail the fake news or the various dimensions of all unwanted things which are happening onto online. Like, what is your view onto the state's approach towards thinking of privacy laws? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, sir, for the question. Yes, this is something which is coming up now. It's very important, but India, I say that India is thinking about it, and data protection laws have been being contemplated in India. And since it is not only important, now it is a part of the right, it has more become a part of constitutional right of Indians, because nowadays data is being fudged, it's being misused. So India, I will not say that government is not at all thinking. Government is definitely thinking about personal data protection laws, and the Indian Information Technology Act was implemented in 2000. There have been efforts being taken under section 43A of the Indian Information Technology Act. A corporate body who is possessing, dealing or handling personal sensitive data and is negligent in implementing who is resulting in wrongful loss or gain of any person is liable to pay damages. So it's not that the government is not at all thinking, but yes, the surveillance factor, it has to balance regarding the pandemic. there is a lot of RTIs being made, journalists being harassed. So government have to look into that matter, because it can't say that it is above scrutiny, above law. We all know how the PM Cares Fund, was under the scanner, but nothing came out of it. So an RTI was also done. So sensitive personal data of people should be protected, and government is thinking about it, but more has to be done. It is something which has to be balanced with the surveillance which government is doing to contain the pandemic. Because in the name of surveillance, when data is being given, it cannot be permanently taken up by the government and misused. We know that in many states this has been happening, and I've already said about the stigmatization that is going on. People are being thrown out from their houses because when we are talking about uploading of selfies within an hour with home address location, why do we need to give home address of a person who is affected? How does it add to the information to people who are living in other neighborhoods or other countries? They are also being able to know who is who is a affected person and who is not. So government has to be sensitive. I think this sensitive mind is lacking. People who are in the governance, that's why I have talked about hauling up of internet governance. It has to be policies and strategies has to be rethought, and definitely government has the potential to come up with something which is much better than what is happening. The laws which are on the anvil, it was a personal data protection information law which was on the anvil. It was about to be passed in 2019 December, but due to the pandemic, it has been put on hold. So we have to think about procedures where the government can pitch in and act for the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Koil, for your very insightful idea. And now I once again would like to thank all the panelists for contributing into this particular panel and bringing in a lot of new ideas in order to understand the real impact of COVID-19 or the pandemic, which has affected in all our walks of life, like whether it is health sector, whether it's economics, whether it's state lockdown, or whether it's a digital economy, digital platform, all has been affected by this particular pandemic. And thereby, this is my sincere thanks to all the panelists who have I brought in. Yeah.
Sir, I would like to propose.
From my side, I'm making my thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. You propose. From my side, I just want to finish up. So
yes.
There was this, like there was a sincere attempt by all the author to really put their 10 minutes presentation in nutshell, because this actually requires a lot of time to really give you an explanation of what are the impact of COVID-19 onto different sectors. And thereby you also see, especially you when you think of an topic, you definitely would like to have some new insights, some facts, and some myths which are prevalent. And thereby there has been a lot of new ideas which are covered by all the panelists, right from Professor Fulu to Professor Subodh, Professor Santesh, Dr. Koil, who has contributed to this particular idea of the impact of COVID-19 onto various walks of life. Now over to the organizers who are waiting to finish up their fine work to be done. Yeah, over to Amruta.
Thank you so much, sir. Distinguished chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the end of this session, it is my great honor to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of WPC. I would like to express our gratitude and sincere thanks to Dr. Liaquat A. Khan for accepting our request to chair the session. We would like to extend our senior thanks to all the speakers for delivering such a comprehensive and insightful presentation. We are honored to have all the speakers with us here today. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Last but not the least, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for our audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching this live. We're truly honored to have you all with us since morning and hope to stay connected with you in future as well. I request all of you to kindly join us for the next session. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.